Hey everybody, this week we are talking about God's plan. Which, I don't know if talking about God's plan is God's plan, but it's my plan, so let's talk about it. Hey Internet, my name is Jeff, and I'm a pastor. And over the summer, I was leading this Bible study where we were talking about different Christian buzzwords or buzz phrases that are thrown around a lot, but we don't necessarily talk about too much. And we just had a really interesting discussion about God's plan, or the phrase God's plan, and I thought that I would share it with you because this is just one of those phrases that you hear a lot, right? You know, something being God's plan, or somebody talking about a certain event in their life and saying that it was God's plan, or I don't know. I used to hang out with people that we would even go to the mall and they would find a parking spot and they would say, oh, clearly it's God's plan for us to be here today, that we got such a great parking spot. Okay. Bottom line, we throw this phrase around a lot sometimes, and so it's probably worth talking about. Now, I just want to share a couple of stories about God's plan, and one of them was that I was in Washington, D.C. with a group of teenagers from the youth group of my church, and we were there on a short-term mission trip, and while we were in worship the first night, our bus got broken into, and they stole all of the snacks and a GPS. That sounds like a very outdated phrase. They stole our GPS because apparently we're using a designated GPS and not just like our phones. Anyway, they stole our GPS, they stole a bunch of snacks, they stole a bunch of other things. So we're waiting outside for the police to show up and for them to write a report. And one of the people who worked for the organization where we were doing the short-term mission trip, they were like, well, in worship, we were talking about being a little bit too attached to your possessions, so maybe it was God's plan that your bus got broken into. Yep, that actually happened, and it didn't go over too well with me or the rest of the leadership who was there in Washington, D.C. with us. So that's one thing that probably needs to be said early on about the phrase God's plan or it's God's plan, which is maybe don't say it. This is one that is probably well worth leaving alone. But anyway, we'll get to that a little bit later. I want to tell another story. I went to a Christian college, and so there was so much stress around choosing a major because there was all sorts of conversation about, well, is it God's plan for you to be a communications major, or is it God's plan for you to be a biology major, or is it God's plan, right? There was so much emphasis on God's plan that it added so much extra stress. Another thing, I went to high school and college during the height of the purity movement, so there was a lot of emphasis on finding God's perfect match for you. God has the perfect man out there for you, or the perfect woman out there for you. So, you need to find God's perfect match for you. There was this tyranny of God's plan hanging over our heads. So God's plan, it was always kind of presented to me as something that was very constricting. Like there's one thing that God wants you to do, and you better do it, and you better figure that out. When you go downstairs in the morning, there's Lucky Charms and there's Fruit Loops, and it's God's perfect plan for you to choose one and not the other. I mean, I'm being a little bit ridiculous here, but well, am I being ridiculous here, or am I just highlighting the ridiculousness of that phrase that we use sometimes, God's plan or God's perfect plan? So I just want to draw attention to how exactly this phrase, this word plan, is used in the Bible. So let's start with the Old Testament. In the Old Testament, the word for plan is the Hebrew word Yadah, and this means something like thoughts or intentions. Thoughts or intentions. You see how much softer that is than plan or God's perfect plan, right? It's thoughts, intentions. It's a little bit more general, as well as being a little bit more soft. And there are a couple of interesting things about God's plan or God's Yadah in the Old Testament. So at creation, you find a plan. And that plan is encapsulated really well in the Hebrew word shalom. It means something like peace, But if you dig at it a little bit more, you see that it means something like everything is in its proper place and working together. God, humanity, and creation, all of these three things are in their proper place and in right relationship, and everything's firing on all cylinders. If you want a good example of shalom or a good illustration of shalom, just think about a watch. Think about tearing open the back of a pocket watch and seeing all of the gears and springs and switches all in their proper place, all working together in harmony. That's shalom. And when one thing is out of place, then there's a disruption in all sorts of different other places in that pocket watch, and there's a disruption of shalom. So God's plan, that general plan, thoughts or intentions towards the world, is shalom. Everything is in right relationship with everything else. Human beings with other human beings with creation, human beings with God, God with creation, all of these things interacting with each other perfectly. Another interesting thing about the Old Testament usage of Yadah, or again in English plan or God's plan, is that when you look at all of the different places that it's used, like if you do a word search in the Bible and you look up plan, there's a big spike in usage in the first part of the book of Isaiah. And the first part of the book of Isaiah is all about how God's people have been captured by the Babylonians, they've been hauled off into exile, and God has a plan, God has a Yadah to restore them. So in the Old Testament, what's God's plan? Well, it's not something very specific for every single person. It's not like every single person has one very solid, perfect plan. Instead, the way that the Old Testament talks about God's plan is a restoration of shalom, or something that brings freedom or liberation to people. Now let's talk about the New Testament real quick. The New Testament, in Greek, the word for plan is boule, and guess what it means? It also means something like thoughts or intentions or preferences, wishes, desires. Again, something much softer than a perfect, solidified, written in stone plan for everybody, including their major and their future spouse. And one thing that's interesting is that the only person that's mentioned as having some sort of divine plan in the New Testament is Jesus. Not Peter, not Paul, not John, not Mary Magdalene. Nobody else has God's perfect plan for their life. The only person that's mentioned as having a specific divine plan for their life is Jesus. And when you take a look at one passage in particular, in Ephesians chapter 1, verses 9 and 10, it talks about how God's plan with Jesus was to restore everything to God's self. It literally says something like, gather all things up in Jesus, which kind of sounds like the restoration of shalom, doesn't it? Gathering all things back up together into their right place, right relationship with everything else. So just some practical things to wrap up about God's plan. First of all, just don't use this phrase. Right? When somebody is grieving or suffering and you're tempted to say maybe this was God's plan, please don't do it. I don't think I can name a single situation where that has gone over well, but I can name dozens and dozens of situations where somebody has said that to me or to one of my parishioners, and they're coming to me years later saying, I've been angry with God because this person flippantly said that my grandma dying was God's plan or something like that. So God's plan, don't say it. Please, I'm begging you, as a pastor, don't just throw this out to people. But if you're trying to think about what God's plan for your life might be, don't think about it as something that is so specific that it's giving you like a sense of apathy or nihilism or paralysis thinking about, well, what's going to happen with my life? And is it going to happen according to God's plan? Well, just ease up a little bit, because the words that the Bible uses, Yadah and boule, they don't talk about God's plan that way. They talk about God's desires and wishes for creation. So instead of thinking about God's plan as, well, who am I going to marry? What job should I have? You know, all of these sorts of things. Instead, just think, today, what's going to bring freedom or liberation for people? Today, what can I do to make somebody in my life or help make myself a little bit more free? Or think, what can I do to restore shalom just a little bit today? Is there a relationship, maybe a broken relationship in my life that I can foster just a little bit so that that brings us together, gathers us back together in Jesus? Am I doing something that's causing some sort of rift between me and creation? Am I only seeing creation as a series of resources that can be exploited? And can my mind change a little bit about that? And can I start treating creation differently? That mending of your relationship with creation might be restoring shalom just a little bit. And that is all about God's plan. All right, so that's it, everybody. Thank you for watching. Click like and subscribe, and maybe leave a comment. Maybe not. I'll leave that up to you. Maybe it's God's plan for you too. Maybe it's not. I don't know. Whatever. Grace and peace.